Welcome to One Book, One Coffee, where we explore the books that shape minds and change lives. You know, the fact that you're here, choosing to spend your time with Machiavelli's The Prince, tells me something remarkable about you. You could be scrolling through endless feeds or binge-watching the latest series, but instead, you've chosen to wrestle with one of history's most controversial and influential texts. That curiosity, that willingness to engage with difficult ideas, that's what sets you apart. The Prince isn't just a book, it's a mirror held up to power itself. Written over 500 years ago, it remains startlingly relevant in boardrooms, political campaigns, and anywhere people navigate complex human dynamics. This slim volume has influenced everyone from Napoleon Bonaparte to modern CEOs. Henry Kissinger called it essential reading for understanding statecraft, while countless business leaders have quietly applied its insights to corporate strategy. It's been banned, burned, and beloved in equal measure, which tells you everything about its enduring power. Niccolò Machiavelli wrote this not as an academic exercise, but as a desperate man's plea for relevance. Exiled from Florence, tortured for alleged conspiracy, stripped of his political career, he poured his life's observations about power into this letter to Lorenzo de' Medici. He'd watched republics fall, witnessed the brutal realities of leadership, and understood that noble intentions without practical wisdom often lead to disaster. This book emerged from his pain, his exile, and his deep love for his fractured homeland. Now, a quick note before we dive in. This is a detailed chapter-by-chapter walkthrough, so it's going to be a longer session. Take your time with it. There's no rush. If you need to step away, save this video to your watch later or forward the link to yourself on WhatsApp so you can pick up right where you left off. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's walk through this book together, chapter by chapter, idea by idea. Let's begin. Picture this. You're sitting across from someone who's spent decades watching how power really works, someone who's seen empires rise and fall, who's witnessed the messy reality behind the polished facade of politics. That's exactly what Niccolò Machiavelli offers us as we dive into his masterpiece, The Prince. And right from the opening chapters, he cuts through centuries of idealistic political theory with the precision of a surgeon's blade, asking us one fundamental question: how do you actually acquire and hold onto power in the real world? Now think about this for a moment. When we talk about leadership today, whether it's in politics, business, or even running a neighborhood organization, we often get caught up in inspirational rhetoric about vision and values. But Machiavelli forces us to confront a more uncomfortable truth. Before you can inspire anyone, before you can implement any grand vision, you first have to understand the basic mechanics of how authority actually works. It's like trying to build a house without understanding the foundation. You might create something beautiful on paper, but it'll crumble when the first storm hits. Machiavelli begins by doing something that seems almost mundane, but is actually revolutionary. He creates a taxonomy of power. Just as a biologist might classify different species to understand how they survive and thrive in their environments, Machiavelli categorizes the different types of states and the various ways they can be acquired. This isn't academic exercise for its own sake. It's practical wisdom born from watching the Italian city-states of his time constantly rise, fall, merge, and split apart like a political kaleidoscope. He identifies principalities that are entirely new, where a leader must build everything from scratch, and those that are hereditary, where power passes down through family lines like a treasured heirloom. But here's where it gets fascinating. Machiavelli argues that hereditary rulers actually have it easier, not because they're more talented or deserving, but because people become accustomed to their rule. It's the political equivalent of breaking in a comfortable pair of shoes. Once the initial adjustment period is over, everything just fits naturally. Think about modern monarchies like those in Britain or Sweden. These institutions persist not because of any particular genius of their current occupants, but because They've become woven into the cultural fabric over generations. The real challenge, Machiavelli suggests, comes with what he calls mixed principalities, situations where a new ruler takes control of territories that already have their own established customs, laws, and loyalties. This is where things get messy, and frankly, where most modern leadership challenges actually lie. Consider a CEO taking over a company with a strong existing culture, or a politician trying to govern a coalition of different interest groups. The fundamental dynamics Machiavelli describes remain strikingly relevant. He tells us that when you acquire new territories, and we can think of this as any situation where you're trying to extend your influence into unfamiliar terrain, you face a critical choice. You can either completely uproot the existing system, which is brutal but sometimes effective, or you can try to work within the existing framework, which is more humane but often unstable. It's like renovating a house. Do you tear everything down to the studs and start fresh, or do you try to work around the existing plumbing and electrical systems? What makes Machiavelli's analysis so compelling is how he refuses to shy away from the darker realities of these choices. He's not advocating for cruelty, but he's acknowledging that sometimes gentle approaches fail, and the resulting chaos can be far worse than decisive action would have been. Think about a manager who avoids making tough personnel decisions to spare feelings, only to watch team morale and productivity collapse as problems fester. Machiavelli would argue that such kindness is actually a form of cruelty, not just to the organization, but to all the people whose livelihoods depend on its success. The prince in Machiavelli's framework must be a student of circumstances. Some situations call for the lion's strength, others for the fox's cunning. Some territories can be governed lightly, with local customs preserved and local leaders co-opted. Others require complete transformation. The key insight here isn't that one approach is always better than another, but that effective leadership requires the wisdom to diagnose what each unique situation demands. As we settle deeper into our exploration of the prince, we'll discover that this initial framework for understanding different types of power serves as the foundation for everything that follows. Because once you understand how authority is acquired, the next logical question becomes even more pressing. How do you keep it? And that's where Machiavelli's advice becomes both more controversial and more practically valuable than almost anything written before or since. Picture this. You're sitting in your favorite coffee shop, steam rising from your mug, and someone asks you a deceptively simple question. What's harder, keeping something you've inherited or holding onto something you fought tooth and nail to win? Now, you might think the answer is obvious, but Niccolò Machiavelli, writing over 500 years ago, understood something profound about power that most people miss entirely. Let's dive into one of the most fascinating insights from The Prince, where Machiavelli explains why hereditary rulers, those born into power, have it so much easier than conquerors who seize new territories. It's a lesson that applies far beyond medieval Italian city-states and reaches into every corner of our modern world. Think about it this way. When you inherit your family's business, you're not just getting the assets and the building. You're inheriting relationships built over decades, trust that's been earned through countless interactions, and systems that have been refined through trial and error. The customers know your family name. The suppliers have worked with your father and grandfather. There's an entire ecosystem of loyalty and familiarity that comes with the territory. Machiavelli understood this perfectly when he observed that hereditary princes face far fewer challenges than those who conquer new lands. But why is this the case? Machiavelli's reasoning is brilliantly practical. When you inherit power, people are already accustomed to your family's rule. They've grown up under this system. Their fathers and grandfathers lived under it. There's a comfort in the familiar, even when that familiar isn't perfect. It's like that old saying about the devil you know being better than the devil you don't. People resist change, especially dramatic change, and a hereditary ruler represents continuity rather than upheaval. Now contrast this with someone who conquers new territory. Imagine you're a tech entrepreneur who just acquired a rival company. Suddenly, you're dealing with employees who didn't choose to work for you, who might resent the takeover, who have different corporate cultures and ways of doing things. Every decision you make is scrutinized. Every change feels like an attack on their previous way of life. This is exactly what a conquering prince faces, but with life and death consequences. Machiavelli illustrates this with examples from his own time. Take the Duke of Ferrara, who successfully defended his hereditary lands against powerful enemies like Venice and Pope Julius II. Why could he survive where others might have fallen? Because his people saw him as their legitimate ruler. They fought for him not just out of fear, but out of a sense of natural order. He didn't have to prove himself worthy of their loyalty. He simply had to avoid being spectacularly incompetent. Here's where Machiavelli's insight becomes almost startling in its simplicity. A hereditary ruler only needs to avoid making catastrophic mistakes. Think of it like maintaining a well-established garden versus trying to cultivate new, wild land. In the garden, you're working with soil that's already been prepared, plants that know where to grow, and systems that largely take care of themselves. You just need to water regularly and pull the occasional weed. But when you're breaking new ground, everything is a struggle. The soil might be rocky, the climate hostile, and you're constantly fighting against the natural tendency of the land to return to its wild state. But let's bring this into our world for a moment. Consider family businesses that have lasted generations. Why do some thrive while others crumble when handed down? The successful ones understand Machiavelli's principle. They don't try to revolutionize everything the moment they take control. They respect the relationships and systems that brought success, making gradual improvements rather than dramatic overhauls. They understand that their inherited authority gives them a foundation that shouldn't be carelessly discarded. On the flip side, think about corporate mergers and acquisitions. How many times have we seen promising companies destroyed not by external competition, but by new leadership that failed to understand the culture and relationships they had acquired? The new leaders come in with grand plans for transformation, not realizing that they're essentially conquering princes trying to rule over people who never chose them and don't trust their vision. Machiavelli's wisdom here isn't just about political power, it's about human nature itself. We're creatures of habit and tradition. We find comfort in predictable patterns and familiar faces. When someone inherits authority within these existing patterns, they're working with the grain of human psychology rather than against it. The beauty of this insight is that it reveals something crucial about sustainable power. It's not always about being the smartest or the strongest or the most innovative. Sometimes, it's about understanding what people need to feel secure and building from there. A hereditary ruler who grasps this can maintain power with surprisingly little effort, while a conqueror who ignores it will find themselves fighting an uphill battle every single day. As we move forward in our exploration of the prince, keep this fundamental principle in mind. Machiavelli is showing us that power isn't just about taking it. It's about understanding the invisible threads that hold societies together, and working with those threads rather than trying to weave an entirely new fabric from scratch. Welcome back to our journey through Machiavelli's masterpiece. I hope you've got your coffee ready because we're diving into something absolutely fascinating today. You know how in the last section we talked about completely new principalities? Well, now Machiavelli wants us to think about something even trickier. Picture this. You're a ruler who already has an established kingdom, and suddenly you acquire new territories. Maybe through conquest, maybe through marriage, maybe through some clever political maneuvering. Now you're sitting there with your original lands that know you, trust you, understand your ways, and then you've got these brand new territories filled with people who have never heard of you, who have their own customs, their own leaders, their own way of doing things. This is what Machiavelli calls a mixed principality, and let me tell you, it's like trying to blend oil and water while riding a unicycle. Think about this for a moment. When you rule people who have known your family for generations, who understand your laws, who speak your language, governance feels almost natural, doesn't it? It's like wearing a perfectly tailored suit. But the moment you add new territories to the mix, everything becomes exponentially more complex. Machiavelli understood this deeply because he lived through it. He watched as powerful Italian city-states tried to expand, as French kings attempted to hold onto Italian territories, as Spanish rulers juggled lands across continents. He saw firsthand how even the most capable leaders could stumble when they underestimated the unique challenges of mixed rule. Here's where Machiavelli gets really practical, and honestly, it's advice that applies far beyond medieval kingdoms. He argues that the biggest mistake rulers make is assuming they can govern new territories exactly the same way they govern their original lands. It's like a successful restaurant owner thinking they can open a location in Tokyo and serve exactly the same menu with exactly the same service style without any adaptation. The food might be excellent, but cultural misunderstandings will sink the venture faster than you can say customer satisfaction. Machiavelli tells us about Louis XII of France, who managed to conquer Milan with surprising ease. The Milanese were actually happy to get rid of their previous ruler, so they welcomed the French with open arms. But here's where it gets interesting. Louis made what seemed like smart moves initially. He eliminated the previous ruling family to prevent any comeback attempts. He didn't heavily tax the new territories. He kept their existing laws and customs intact. Sounds reasonable, right? Yet despite these seemingly wise decisions, Louis eventually lost Milan, and Machiavelli uses this as a perfect case study in how good intentions aren't enough when you're dealing with mixed principalities. The problem, according to our Florentine friend, was that Louis tried to manage his new Italian territories from France. Now, imagine trying to run a business remotely in a culture you don't fully understand, with employees who speak a different language, facing competitors who know the local market intimately. That's essentially what Louis was attempting. Machiavelli argues that when you acquire new territories, especially ones that are culturally or geographically distant from your base, you need to either live there yourself or establish such a strong local presence that it's as if you're living there. But here's what makes this even more relevant today. Think about modern corporations that expand internationally, or even tech companies that try to enter new markets. The principles are remarkably similar. You can't just copy and paste your business model from one culture to another and expect it to work seamlessly. You need to understand local customs, build relationships with local power brokers, and sometimes make compromises that might seem counterintuitive from your original perspective. Machiavelli also warns about the danger of relying too heavily on local allies who helped you acquire the new territory in the first place. These allies, he observes, often have their own agendas. They supported your takeover because they expected personal benefits, and when those benefits don't materialize exactly as they imagined, they can quickly become your most dangerous enemies. It's a bit like political coalitions today. The groups that help a candidate win an election often become the most vocal critics when campaign promises meet the reality of governance. The deeper insight here is about the fundamental tension in mixed principalities between maintaining unity and respecting diversity. You need your different territories to function as one cohesive unit, but you also can't steamroll over local traditions and expectations without creating resentment that will eventually explode into rebellion. It's a delicate balance that requires what we might call emotional intelligence today, though Machiavelli would probably just call it smart politics. As we move forward in our exploration, keep this tension in mind. The challenges of mixed principalities reveal something profound about leadership itself. The moment you expand beyond your comfort zone, your original playbook becomes insufficient. You need new strategies, deeper understanding, and perhaps most importantly, the humility to recognize that what made you successful in one context might actually work against you in another. Picture this. You're sitting across from someone who's just conquered a thriving democracy, and they're asking you for advice on how to keep control. Sounds like a scene from a dystopian thriller, right? Well, welcome to one of the most chilling chapters in Machiavelli's playbook, where he lays out exactly 3 options for dealing with conquered republics. And trust me, none of them are pretty. Now, think about this for a moment. What makes a republic different from any other territory you might conquer? It's the people's taste of freedom. Once people have experienced self-governance, once they've had a say in their own destiny, that memory doesn't just fade away like morning mist. It burns in their hearts like an ember that's always ready to burst into flame. Machiavelli understood this fundamental truth about human nature, and it terrified him as much as it should terrify any would-be conqueror. So what are these 3 brutal options? Let's walk through them together, and I want you to imagine you're that prince facing this impossible choice. Option 1 is perhaps the most straightforward, though it makes your stomach turn just thinking about it: complete destruction. Not just defeating the republic, but utterly annihilating it. We're talking about wiping entire cities off the map, scattering the population to the winds, erasing not just the government but the very memory of what once was. Think of it like this. If you can't remove the thorn from your side, you cut out the entire piece of flesh around it. Machiavelli points to the Romans and their handling of certain Greek cities as examples of this approach. When faced with persistent rebellion, they didn't just change governments or install governors. They systematically dismantled entire communities, brick by brick, life by life. It's brutal, yes, but from a purely strategic standpoint, it's also effective. You can't have a revolution if there's no one left to revolt and no place to call home. But here's where it gets interesting, and this is where Machiavelli's genius really shines through. He's not advocating for this approach because he's some kind of monster. He's simply acknowledging a harsh reality about power and human nature. Sometimes, he argues, half measures are more cruel than decisive action because they prolong suffering and guarantee future conflict. Option 2 takes us in a completely different direction. Go live there yourself. Pack up your court, move your entire operation to the conquered republic, and rule from within. This isn't just about planting a flag and calling it yours. This is about fundamentally changing your own life and the structure of your power to accommodate this new reality. Think about the psychological impact of this choice. When the conqueror becomes a neighbor, when the distant tyrant becomes the guy you might bump into at the market, everything changes. The conquered people can see you, understand you, maybe even influence you. And you, as the ruler, are forced to truly understand them, their customs, their daily struggles, their dreams. It's like the difference between managing a company remotely versus actually working on the factory floor every day. This approach has its own brutal logic. By immersing yourself completely in the conquered territory, you can spot trouble before it starts brewing. You can reward loyalty immediately and punish rebellion swiftly. But it also means you're constantly vulnerable, constantly exposed, constantly having to prove your legitimacy not through distant authority but through daily competence. The third option might seem the most civilized at first glance. Preserve their laws but extract tribute and establish a government of a few citizens who will keep the state friendly to you. Essentially, you're creating a puppet government, maintaining the appearance of the old system while ensuring the real power flows back to you. Now, here's where Machiavelli drops a bombshell of insight that's as relevant today as it was 500 years ago. This option, he argues, is actually the most dangerous of all. Why? Because it creates the worst of both worlds. The people still remember their freedom, but now they also have to live with the daily humiliation of seeing their own neighbors collaborate with their conquerors. It's like being forced to watch a bad remake of your favorite movie every single day. These puppet governments, Machiavelli observes, are inherently unstable because they depend on the continued favor of both the conqueror and the conquered. The moment that delicate balance shifts, the moment the people decide they've had enough, or the conqueror decides the arrangement isn't profitable enough, everything collapses. And when it does collapse, it's often more violent and chaotic than if you'd chosen one of the other two options from the beginning. What makes this analysis so unsettling and so brilliant is how clearly we can see these patterns playing out throughout history and even in our modern world. Whether we're talking about colonial powers managing distant territories, corporations acquiring competitors, or even personal relationships where one party holds significantly more power than the other, these same dynamics emerge again and again. As we move forward in our journey through The Prince, keep these three options in mind, because they reveal something fundamental about Machiavelli's entire philosophy. Sometimes the most moral choice is to acknowledge that all your options are terrible and choose the one that causes the least long-term suffering, even if it appears more brutal in the short term. So we've talked about inherited power, but now let's dive into something far more fascinating and frankly more relevant to most of us today. Picture this. You're sitting across from me with your coffee getting cold because you're so absorbed in this conversation about power. We're about to explore what happens when someone rises from nothing to everything through pure talent, grit, and strategic thinking. This is Machiavelli's chapter on new principalities won by arms and ability, and trust me, this is where things get really interesting. Now think about this for a moment. What's harder, maintaining something you inherited or building something from scratch? Machiavelli is crystal clear on this point. When you seize power through your own abilities, you face incredible difficulties getting there, but once you're established, you're actually in a stronger position than someone who simply inherited their throne. Why? Because you've proven you have what it takes. You've developed the skills, the networks, the street smarts that got you there in the first place. Machiavelli gives us some absolutely brilliant examples from history, and I want you to really visualize these stories because they're not just ancient history, they're blueprints. Take Moses, leading the Israelites out of Egypt. Here's a man who had to convince an entire population to follow him into the wilderness, facing down the most powerful empire of his time. Or consider Cyrus of Persia, who built an empire from a small tribal kingdom. Then there's Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome, who literally had to create a city and a civilization from nothing. And Theseus, uniting the scattered tribes of Attica into what would become Athens. What do all these leaders have in common? They didn't rely on luck or inheritance. They had vision, they had the ability to inspire others, and crucially, they had the military and political skills to back up their ambitions. But here's the thing that Machiavelli really wants us to understand. Their greatest challenge wasn't external enemies. It was convincing people to believe in something that didn't exist yet. Think about any startup founder today, any political outsider who rises to prominence, any social movement leader. They face the exact same challenge. People are naturally suspicious of change. Those who benefit from the old system will fight tooth and nail to preserve it, while those who might benefit from the new system are hesitant to commit because, well, it's unproven. Sound familiar? This is why Machiavelli says that all armed prophets succeed while unarmed prophets fail. It's not about violence for its own sake. It's about having the power to protect your vision when others try to destroy it. Let me paint you a picture with a modern example. Think about how Elon Musk approached the automotive industry. The established car manufacturers had every incentive to keep things as they were. Dealers, suppliers, entire economic ecosystems were built around internal combustion engines. Musk couldn't just have a good idea about electric cars. He needed the resources, the technical expertise, the manufacturing capability, and yes, the financial firepower to survive the inevitable pushback. He needed to be an armed prophet, metaphorically speaking. But here's where Machiavelli gets really insightful, and this is something I want you to remember long after you've finished your coffee. These self-made leaders face a paradox. The very qualities that help them rise to power, that independence, that willingness to break rules, that ability to see beyond conventional wisdom, these same qualities can make it difficult for them to work within established systems once they achieve their goals. Machiavelli observes that such leaders must be incredibly adaptable. They need to know when to be bold and when to be cautious, when to rely on their own judgment, and when to listen to advisors. Most importantly, they need to understand that the skills that got them to power might not be the same skills needed to maintain it. Now, here's something that might surprise you about this chapter. Machiavelli isn't just talking about political power. He's describing a universal principle about achievement and leadership that applies whether you're running a country, building a business, or leading any kind of organization. The person who earns their position through demonstrated ability has a kind of legitimacy that can't be bought or inherited. People might fear them, they might resent them, but they respect them because they've proven themselves under fire. As we move forward in our exploration of the prince, keep this foundation in mind. We're going to see how these principles of earned authority play out in different scenarios, how they interact with luck and circumstance, and why Machiavelli believes that virtue, in his specific sense of the word, trumps almost everything else in the long game of power. The coffee might be getting cold, but these ideas, they're as hot and relevant as ever. Picture yourself sitting in your favorite coffee shop, steam rising from your mug, as we dive into one of the most unsettling chapters of Machiavelli's masterpiece. We've been exploring how princes come to power, and now we're venturing into treacherous territory, the world of those who rise not through their own merit or military conquest, but through sheer luck or the whims of others. Think of it as winning the political lottery, and as Machiavelli warns us, lottery winners often end up broke. Imagine you're scrolling through social media, and suddenly see that your college roommate has been appointed CEO of a major corporation because his uncle sits on the board. Or perhaps you witness a political outsider catapulted to high office because they happen to catch the wave of public sentiment at just the right moment. These scenarios capture exactly what Machiavelli means by principalities acquired through fortune, power that falls into someone's lap, rather than being earned through blood, sweat, and strategic thinking. Now, think about this for a moment. What's the fundamental problem with getting something you haven't worked for? Machiavelli puts it brilliantly when he observes that those who rise rapidly through fortune have not had time to learn how to command. It's like being handed the keys to a Formula One race car when you've only ever driven in a parking lot. The speed of ascension becomes the very thing that dooms them to failure. Machiavelli illustrates this with fascinating historical examples that feel surprisingly contemporary. He tells us about Francesco Sforza, who rose from being a simple soldier to Duke of Milan through decades of military campaigns, political maneuvering, and strategic alliances. Compare him to Caesar Borgia, who became a powerful ruler primarily because his father happened to be Pope Alexander VI. Sforza's power had deep roots. He understood every aspect of governance because he'd fought for every inch of territory. Borgia, despite his undeniable talents, was essentially building his empire on quicksand. Here's where it gets really interesting, and where Machiavelli's insights feel almost prophetic about our modern world. Think about startup founders who become overnight billionaires when their companies go public. Some of them, like those who have spent years building their business from the ground up, tend to weather market downturns and competition. But others, who perhaps stumbled onto success through timing or connections, often find themselves overwhelmed when real challenges arise. They lack what Machiavelli calls the foundations, the deep understanding that only comes from gradual, earned experience. The psychological dimension here is fascinating too. When you've climbed every rung of the ladder, you develop not just skills but also the confidence that comes from proven competence. You've faced setbacks before and learned to overcome them. But when you're suddenly thrust into power, you're like someone who's never learned to swim being thrown into the deep end. Every decision feels overwhelming because you lack the experiential framework to evaluate options effectively. Machiavelli drives this point home with a metaphor that's pure gold. He compares fortune to a river that, when calm, seems manageable, but when it floods, destroys everything in its path. Those who rise through fortune, he suggests, are like people who build their houses in the floodplain during the dry season. They're seduced by the apparent ease and beauty of their situation, never preparing for the inevitable deluge. But here's what makes Machiavelli such a brilliant observer of human nature. He doesn't just diagnose the problem. He offers a remedy. Even if you've gained power through fortune, you can still succeed, but only if you immediately begin building the foundations you initially lacked. You need to cultivate allies, develop your own competencies, and create systems that don't depend solely on the continued goodwill of those who elevated you. Consider modern political leaders who rise to power through celebrity or populist waves. Those who succeed long-term are typically the ones who quickly surround themselves with experienced advisors, immerse themselves in policy details, and build independent power bases. Those who fail often remain trapped in the mindset that got them there, believing that charisma or luck alone will continue to carry them forward. The most chilling insight Machiavelli offers is about dependency. When your power derives from others, you're essentially a prisoner of their continued approval. Your fortune becomes tied to forces beyond your control, the health of your patron, the shifting winds of public opinion, or the strategic interests of those who elevated you. It's like being a surfer who never learns to read the waves, forever dependent on others to tell you when to paddle. As we wrap up this exploration of fortune's dangerous gifts, remember that Machiavelli isn't just writing about Renaissance princes. He's illuminating a timeless truth about power, success, and human nature that applies whether you're running a company, leading a team, or simply trying to build a stable, meaningful life. The question isn't whether fortune will smile on you. It's whether you'll be wise enough to use that smile as a starting point rather than a final destination. Picture this. You're sitting in a medieval Italian city-state, watching two very different paths to power unfold before your eyes. On one side, there's a charismatic leader who's won the hearts of ordinary citizens, the merchants, the craftsmen, the people who work with their hands. On the other side, there's someone who's climbed the ladder by courting the wealthy elite, the noble families who control the purse strings and pull the political strings. Which path would you choose? Well, Machiavelli has some fascinating insights about this choice that might surprise you. In what we might call the chapter on the citizen prince, Machiavelli dives deep into one of the most crucial decisions any aspiring leader faces, whether to build your foundation on popular support or noble backing. Now, think about this for a moment. Isn't this the same choice politicians face today when they decide whether to be populists appealing to everyday voters or establishment figures courting big donors and party insiders? Machiavelli argues quite boldly that if you're going to pick just one group to support you, choose the people every single time. Why? Well, imagine you're building a house. The nobles are like building on quicksand. They're fickle, they have their own agendas, and the moment a better opportunity comes along, they'll abandon you faster than you can say political alliance. The people, on the other hand, are like bedrock. When they truly believe in you, when they see you as their champion, they'll stick with you through thick and thin. Here's where Machiavelli gets really practical. He points out something that every modern political consultant would nod along with. The nobles think they're equals to any prince. They've got money, influence, and connections of their own. They don't really need you. They're doing you a favor by supporting you, and they know it. This creates what we might call a relationship of mutual exploitation rather than genuine loyalty. The people, however, have a simpler and more powerful motivation. They just want someone who won't crush them, someone who will protect them from being oppressed. That's it. No complicated schemes, no hidden agendas, just basic human dignity and security. Now, let me paint you a picture that Machiavelli would have loved. Think about a successful tech entrepreneur who starts a company. They could either focus on impressing venture capitalists and wealthy investors, the modern equivalent of nobles, or they could build something that genuinely serves ordinary customers. The entrepreneur who creates a product that millions of regular people love and depend on has built something much more sustainable than the one who's just playing financial games with elite investors. When trouble comes, and it always does, guess who has the more loyal base? But here's where Machiavelli shows his genius for nuance. He's not saying you should ignore the nobles entirely. That would be political suicide. Instead, he's advocating for what we might call a people-first strategy with careful noble management. You make the people your primary base, your unshakable foundation, but you're smart enough not to unnecessarily antagonize the powerful elite. You just don't depend on them for your survival. Consider how this plays out in the business world today. The most successful companies, think Apple, Amazon, or even local businesses that thrive for decades, are those that build genuine customer loyalty while maintaining decent relationships with investors and industry insiders. They know their bread is buttered by the people who actually use their products, not just the people who happen to have money. Machiavelli illustrates this with examples from his own time, showing how princes who relied too heavily on noble support found themselves isolated when crisis hit. The nobles would simply switch sides, calculate new advantages, and leave their former patron high and dry. Meanwhile, princes who had earned genuine popular support could weather incredible storms because ordinary people had a real stake in their success. There's something deeply democratic about this insight, even though Machiavelli wasn't exactly writing a manual for democracy. He recognized that sustainable power comes from serving the interests of the many rather than the few. It's not about being nice or moral, it's about being smart and strategic. So the next time you see a political leader, a business executive, or even a community organizer making choices about where to focus their energy, ask yourself, are they building their foundation on the solid ground of popular support, or are they dancing on the shifting sands of elite approval? Machiavelli would tell you that this choice, more than almost any other, will determine whether they rise and fall with the winds of fortune, or whether they build something that can truly last. As we move forward in our exploration of power and leadership, keep this central insight in mind, because understanding the difference between these two paths might just change how you see every leader you encounter. So far, we've been talking about princes who rule through military might, political cunning, or sheer luck. But now, my friend, we need to talk about a completely different breed of ruler, one that operates by rules so unique they might as well be from another planet. Grab your coffee a little tighter, because we're diving into what Machiavelli calls ecclesiastical principalities, and trust me, this is where things get fascinating. Picture this. You're sitting across from Machiavelli in a Florentine cafe, and he suddenly leans forward with that knowing smile of his. He's about to tell you about rulers who don't need armies to stay in power, who don't worry about rebellions, and who somehow manage to keep their subjects happy without even trying. Sounds impossible, right? Well, welcome to the world of religious leadership. Think about the Pope for a moment. Here's a man who rules over the papal states, controls vast wealth, commands respect from kings and emperors, yet he doesn't need to constantly watch his back for assassins or worry about military coups. Why? Because his authority doesn't come from the tip of a sword or the weight of gold in his treasury. It comes from something far more powerful and frankly more mysterious, divine legitimacy. Machiavelli, ever the practical observer, notices something remarkable about these ecclesiastical princes. They acquire their states through ability or fortune, just like any other ruler, but here's the kicker. Once they're in power, they're maintained by what he calls ancient religious institutions. It's like they've tapped into a power source that never runs dry. Their subjects obey not because they fear punishment, but because they believe God himself has ordained this ruler. Now think about this for a second. Every other type of prince we've discussed has to work constantly to maintain power. They're building alliances, crushing enemies, managing the economy, keeping the people fed and content. It's exhausting work, really. But ecclesiastical princes, they govern states that, as Machiavelli puts it, are sustained by higher powers which the human mind cannot reach. It's almost unfair when you think about it. Let me paint you a picture that really drives this home. Imagine two neighboring territories. In one, you have a secular prince who's constantly worried about everything. Are the nobles plotting against me? Is the treasury running low? Will the people revolt if I raise taxes? Are my enemies gathering strength? This poor ruler barely sleeps, always calculating his next move like he's playing chess with death itself. Right next door, you have an ecclesiastical prince who wakes up each morning knowing his authority is unquestionable. His subjects don't just obey him, they revere him. They pay their taxes not grudgingly, but as acts of devotion. They follow his laws not out of fear, but out of faith. It's like he's playing a completely different game with a completely different set of rules. But here's where Machiavelli gets really interesting. He's not just marveling at this phenomenon. He's studying it with the eye of a political scientist. He recognizes that while these ecclesiastical states are incredibly stable, they're also somewhat mysterious to analyze because they operate outside the normal realm of political calculation. You can't apply the usual rules of statecraft to a ruler whose legitimacy comes from heaven. Consider the modern parallels here. Think about spiritual leaders today who wield enormous influence without armies or police forces. The Dalai Lama, for instance, has been in exile for decades, yet his moral authority remains unshakable among his followers. Ayatollahs in Iran don't just rule through political power. They govern through religious conviction that runs deeper than any constitution or law book. Even in secular contexts, we see echoes of this principle. Leaders who successfully tap into something larger than themselves, whether it's a national myth, a revolutionary ideal, or a shared vision of the future, often enjoy a stability that purely transactional leaders can only dream of. They're not just managing a state, they're shepherding a belief system. What makes Machiavelli's analysis so brilliant is his recognition that these ecclesiastical principalities represent both the easiest and the most difficult form of rule to understand. Easiest because once established, they practically run themselves. Most difficult because their foundation rests on something that can't be measured, calculated, or replicated through clever political maneuvering. As we transition from thinking about these almost mystical forms of governance, remember this key insight. Power isn't always about force or fear. Sometimes, the most unshakable authority comes from touching something deeper in the human spirit, something that transcends the everyday concerns of politics and enters the realm of the sacred. It's a lesson that echoes through history and remains profoundly relevant in our modern world of influence and authority. Picture this scene with me for a moment. You're sitting in a Renaissance palace, and outside your window, you can hear the clatter of armor and the shouts of soldiers. But here's the thing that would chill you to the bone if you were a prince in Machiavelli's time, those soldiers marching past. They're not fighting for you, your people, or your cause. They're fighting for whoever pays them the most this week. Welcome to one of Machiavelli's most urgent warnings about the fatal flaw that brought down kingdoms, the reliance on mercenary armies. Now think about this for a second. What happens when you hire someone to do a job they have no personal investment in? Maybe you've experienced this yourself, hiring a contractor who does shoddy work because they know they'll never see you again, or working with someone who's just phoning it in because they don't really care about the outcome. Machiavelli saw this same dynamic playing out on battlefields across Italy, and he was absolutely terrified by what he witnessed. The Italian city-states of his era had fallen into a comfortable but dangerous habit. Instead of maintaining their own armies, they hired professional military companies called condottieri. These mercenary bands seemed like a brilliant solution at first. Why risk your own citizens' lives when you could pay professionals to do the fighting? It was like outsourcing your military the same way a modern company might outsource its customer service. But Machiavelli watched this system collapse spectacularly, and he knew exactly why. Here's the brutal truth he discovered. Mercenaries have no skin in the game. When a hired soldier faces a truly dangerous battle, what's his incentive to fight to the death? He's got no homeland to defend, no family behind him counting on his courage, no deep belief in the cause he's supposedly fighting for. His only real interest is collecting his pay and living to fight another day. As Machiavelli puts it with his characteristic bluntness, mercenaries are disunited, ambitious, without discipline, faithless. They'll abandon you the moment things get tough, or worse yet, they might decide your enemy is offering better terms. Think about the devastating example of the Duke of Milan, who hired the famous condottiero Francesco Sforza to defend his territory. Sforza did such an effective job that he eventually decided he liked Milan so much, he'd just take it for himself. The Duke found himself conquered by his own hired protector. It's like hiring a security company to guard your house, only to discover they've changed the locks and moved in themselves. But Machiavelli's insight goes much deeper than simple betrayal. He understood something profound about human nature and motivation that applies far beyond military affairs. People fight hardest when they're fighting for something that belongs to them, their homes, their families, their way of life. A citizen soldier defending his own city will display courage that no amount of money can buy from a hired gun. There's a reason we still talk about the heroism of ordinary citizens who rose up to defend their communities in times of crisis. Consider the Swiss pikemen that Machiavelli so admired. These weren't professional soldiers in the traditional sense. They were farmers and craftsmen who took up arms to defend their mountain valleys. But they became legendary for their discipline and ferocity because they were literally fighting for their homes. When they formed their pike squares and marched into battle, they knew that defeat meant their families would be enslaved and their villages burned. That kind of motivation creates an entirely different kind of warrior. Now you might be thinking, this is all very interesting history, but what does it mean for us today? Here's where Machiavelli's wisdom becomes startlingly relevant. We live in an age of outsourcing everything, not just military functions, but core responsibilities that perhaps shouldn't be delegated. When companies outsource their customer relationships, they often lose touch with what their customers actually want. When communities rely entirely on outside contractors for essential services, they lose the skills and commitment that come from local ownership. The principle extends even to our personal lives. Think about the difference between hiring someone to renovate your house versus doing the work yourself with friends and family. The hired contractor might do a technically superior job, but there's something irreplaceable about the investment and care that comes from people who will actually live with the results of their work. Machiavelli's call for citizen armies wasn't just about military strategy. It was about the fundamental relationship between a people and their government, between individuals and their community. He believed that a society where citizens were willing to take up arms in defense of their homeland was a society with genuine civic virtue, where people had a real stake in their collective future. As we settle deeper into our conversation about power and governance, this question of who fights and why becomes absolutely crucial to understanding how lasting political strength is built, not on hired loyalty, but on genuine commitment from people who have everything to lose. Picture this. You're settling into your favorite coffee shop chair, steam rising from your mug, and we're about to dive into one of Machiavelli's most fascinating insights about power and survival. Today we're exploring why the prince argues that any leader worth their salt must become both a student and a master of warfare. Now, before you think this is just about medieval battles and sword clashing, stay with me, because what Machiavelli is really talking about here applies to every boardroom, political campaign, and competitive situation you'll ever encounter. Machiavelli opens this section with a statement that might surprise you. He declares that a prince should have no other object or thought, no other profession except war, its organization, and its discipline. Think about this for a moment. He's not saying leaders should be warmongers, but rather that understanding conflict, strategy, and the dynamics of competition should be at the very heart of leadership thinking. Why? Because, as he puts it so bluntly, armed prophets have always conquered, while unarmed prophets have been destroyed. Let's unpack this with a story that Machiavelli himself tells. He points to Francesco Sforza, who rose from being a private citizen to become Duke of Milan, all through his mastery of military arts. Sforza understood that power without the ability to defend it is just a beautiful castle built on quicksand. On the flip side, Machiavelli mentions his sons, who inherited this great duchy but lost it precisely because they avoided the hardships of military life, preferring comfort to the constant vigilance that power demands. It's like inheriting a thriving business and then ignoring the market forces that made it successful in the first place. But here's where it gets really interesting for us today. When Machiavelli talks about the art of war, he's describing something much broader than battlefield tactics. He's outlining a mindset of strategic thinking that applies whether you're running a startup, managing a team, or navigating office politics. Think about the CEO who studies their competitors obsessively, who games out different market scenarios, who prepares for economic downturns even during boom times. That's exactly the kind of thinking Machiavelli is advocating. The prince must study war in two ways, Machiavelli tells us, through action and through the mind. The action part involves constant practice, keeping yourself and your people sharp, understanding your resources and limitations. In modern terms, this translates to staying hands-on with your business, knowing your team's capabilities, understanding your market position. You can't lead effectively from an ivory tower, disconnected from the realities of competition and conflict. But the mental aspect is equally crucial, and this is where Machiavelli's advice becomes almost timeless. He recommends studying history, learning from the successes and failures of great leaders. Read about how they handled crises, how they turned disadvantages into advantages, how they made difficult decisions under pressure. Machiavelli specifically mentions how princes should read about Alexander the Great imitating Achilles, Caesar emulating Alexander, and Scipio following Cyrus. It's like having a master class in leadership strategy taught by history's most successful practitioners. Now, you might be wondering, how does this apply to someone who's not running a country or commanding armies? Consider this. Every industry has its competitive battles. Every organization faces internal and external threats. Every leader must occasionally make decisions that determine survival or failure. The executive who understands competitive dynamics, who prepares for market shifts, who builds resilient teams, is applying Machiavellian principles of strategic thinking. Machiavelli also emphasizes the importance of understanding your terrain, both literally and metaphorically. He suggests that princes should hunt regularly, not just for exercise, but to learn the landscape of their territory. Where are the mountains, valleys, rivers, and marshes? How do these features affect movement and strategy? In today's world, this translates to understanding your competitive landscape. Who are your allies and rivals? What are the regulatory environments, market trends, and technological shifts that could affect your position? The most powerful insight in this section might be Machiavelli's observation that in peacetime, a wise prince thinks more about war than during war itself. This isn't about paranoia. It's about preparation and strategic foresight. The best leaders use calm periods to strengthen their capabilities, build relationships, and prepare for inevitable challenges. They don't wait for crises to start thinking strategically. As we wrap up this exploration of Machiavelli's thoughts on the art of war, remember that he's really talking about the art of strategic leadership. Whether you're defending market share, navigating organizational change, or simply trying to advance your career, the principles remain remarkably relevant. Study your environment, learn from history, stay sharp during good times, and never forget that in a competitive world, the prepared mind and the disciplined approach usually prevail. The question isn't whether you'll face conflict and competition, it's whether you'll be ready when they arrive. You know, there's something fascinating that happens when we watch certain leaders in action. Whether it's a CEO making a bold company pivot, a coach making an unexpected game-changing decision, or even a friend who steps up during a crisis, we find ourselves thinking, Wow, now that's someone I'd follow. Machiavelli understood this phenomenon centuries ago, and in this section of The Prince, he dives deep into one of the most powerful tools a leader can wield: reputation built through decisive action. Picture this scene with me for a moment. You're in Renaissance Italy and news travels slowly, mostly through merchants, travelers, and the occasional diplomatic messenger. In this world, your reputation isn't just important, it's literally everything. It's your currency, your shield, and your sword all rolled into one. Machiavelli knew that in such an environment, a prince's actions would echo far beyond their immediate consequences, shaping how allies, enemies, and subjects would respond for years to come. Now think about this. What makes someone's reputation truly stick? Machiavelli argues it's not the small, everyday decisions, but those pivotal moments when a leader chooses to act decisively, especially when the stakes are high and the outcome uncertain. He calls these great actions, and he's not talking about grand gestures for show. He means those calculated risks that demonstrate both courage and wisdom. Let me share one of his favorite examples. Machiavelli was absolutely fascinated by Ferdinand of Aragon, who later became Ferdinand the Catholic of Spain. This guy was a master of what we might call strategic boldness. When Ferdinand decided to expel the Jews from Spain in 1492, Machiavelli saw it not as a moral choice. Remember, he's analyzing power, not ethics, but as a brilliant political calculation. Ferdinand framed this controversial decision as a religious crusade, which simultaneously consolidated his Christian base, eliminated potential internal opposition, and sent a clear message about his authority to both domestic and foreign audiences. Now, before you start thinking Machiavelli is endorsing such actions, remember he's writing a manual on power, not a moral philosophy. He's observing that Ferdinand's willingness to make this dramatic, irreversible decision created an aura of strength and determination that served him well in future negotiations and conflicts. Other rulers knew they were dealing with someone who wouldn't hesitate to make tough choices. Here's where it gets really interesting for us today. Think about modern leaders who have built legendary reputations through decisive action. Steve Jobs betting the entire company on the iPhone when everyone thought Apple should stick to computers. Nelson Mandela choosing reconciliation over revenge when he could have pursued a very different path. Even in smaller contexts, we see this principle at work. The manager who stands up for their team against unfair corporate pressure, or the entrepreneur who pivots their entire business model based on new information, even when it means admitting their original plan was wrong. What Machiavelli understood, and what rings just as true today, is that reputation isn't built through consistency alone. It's forged in those moments when leaders have to choose between the safe path and the right path, between popular opinion and principled action. The leader who always takes the middle ground, who never makes anyone uncomfortable, who constantly seeks consensus before acting, this person may avoid criticism, but they'll never build the kind of reputation that commands real authority. But here's the crucial nuance that Machiavelli emphasizes. These great actions can't be random or impulsive. They need to serve a larger strategic purpose. The most effective leaders understand their audience. They know which bold moves will enhance their reputation and which will damage it. It's like a master chef who knows exactly when to add that unexpected ingredient that transforms a good dish into something memorable. Timing, context, and understanding your environment are everything. Consider how this plays out in our interconnected world today. When a CEO makes a controversial but principled stand on a social issue, they're playing the same game Ferdinand played, just on a different board. They're calculating that the long-term reputation benefits of being seen as decisive and principled will outweigh the short-term costs of controversy. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're not, but the ones who never take these calculated risks often fade into forgettable mediocrity. Machiavelli also warns us about the flip side of this coin. A reputation, once damaged by indecisive leadership or poor judgment in these crucial moments, is incredibly difficult to repair. In our age of social media and instant global communication, this lesson feels even more relevant. One poorly handled crisis, one moment of visible weakness when strength was needed, and years of careful relationship building can evaporate overnight. As we move forward in our exploration of the prince, keep this central insight in mind. Authority isn't just inherited or appointed. It's earned through moments of decisive action that demonstrate both courage and wisdom. The leaders we remember, the ones whose influence extends far beyond their official titles, understand that reputation is their most valuable asset, and they're willing to take calculated risks to build and protect it. Picture yourself sitting across from Machiavelli himself, steam rising from your coffee cups as he leans forward with that knowing smile. He's about to share one of his most practical insights, something that could save your career, your business, maybe even your relationships. Because here's the thing about choosing advisors get it wrong, and you're not just making bad decisions, you're setting yourself up for spectacular failure. Machiavelli begins with a deceptively simple observation that cuts right to the heart of human nature. He tells us there are three types of minds in this world, and understanding these categories isn't just academic exercise, it's survival knowledge. The first type, he explains, understands things by themselves. These are the rare gems, the people who can see around corners, who grasp complex situations without needing someone to draw them a map. Think of that friend who always seems to know what's coming next, who can read between the lines of every conversation and situation. The second type of mind, and this is where it gets interesting, understands things when they're explained by others. These people aren't necessarily brilliant, but they're smart enough to recognize good advice when they hear it. They're the ones who might not come up with the breakthrough idea themselves, but when you lay it out for them, they get it immediately. They nod along, ask the right questions, and can build on what you're telling them. But then there's the third type, and this is where Machiavelli's cynicism really shines through. These minds neither understand by themselves nor when others explain things to them. They're the black holes of comprehension, the people who will stare blankly at you no matter how clearly you explain something, who will confidently misunderstand your most straightforward instructions. Now, think about this for a moment. How many meetings have you sat through where you watched someone nod along to a perfectly clear explanation, only to do exactly the opposite of what was discussed? How many times have you carefully laid out a plan, thinking you were being crystal clear, only to discover later that your message landed somewhere in an alternate universe? Machiavelli argues that a prince, and by extension, any leader, must be at least the second type. You don't have to be the genius who comes up with everything yourself, but you absolutely must be able to recognize good counsel when you hear it. And here's where his advice becomes almost brutally practical. If you're not even the second type, if you can't distinguish between good and bad advice, then you're doomed from the start. But recognizing good counsel is only half the battle. The real challenge is creating an environment where people will actually give you honest advice. Machiavelli understood something that modern leadership books are still trying to teach. People will tell you what they think you want to hear, not what you need to hear. It's human nature to avoid conflict, to smooth over rough edges, to deliver news wrapped in pretty ribbons. So how do you break through this? Machiavelli suggests something counterintuitive. You have to give people explicit permission to disagree with you, but only at specific times and about specific things. Imagine creating a space where your team knows they can challenge your ideas without fear of retaliation, but also understanding that this permission comes with boundaries and timing. He tells us about rulers who surrounded themselves with flatterers, who created echo chambers where their worst ideas bounced back to them as brilliant insights. These princes lived in bubbles of artificial validation until reality came crashing through their palace walls. Sound familiar? Think about modern executives who fire anyone who brings bad news, or politicians who only listen to their most devoted supporters. The key insight here is that you need to actively cultivate advisors who will tell you uncomfortable truths. But here's the catch. You can't just throw your doors open to everyone with an opinion. Machiavelli warns against taking counsel from too many people, because then you'll be paralyzed by conflicting advice, unable to make any decision at all. Instead, he recommends choosing a small group of wise counselors, people whose judgment you trust and whose motivations you understand. Give these people, and only these people, the freedom to speak honestly about specific matters. When they advise you, listen carefully. When they don't speak up, don't keep asking for their opinion on every little thing. This creates a delicate balance that requires real skill to maintain. You're walking a tightrope between being too closed off to good advice and being so open that you're swayed by every passing opinion. As we'll see in our next discussion about avoiding flatterers and maintaining your independence as a leader, this balance becomes even more crucial when you're trying to maintain your authority while staying connected to reality. Picture this. You're sitting in the corner office, the CEO of a major company, and every single person who walks through your door tells you exactly what you want to hear. Your marketing campaign is brilliant. Your quarterly projections are spot on. Your leadership style is inspiring. Everyone nods enthusiastically at your ideas, laughs at your jokes, and agrees with every strategic decision you make. Sounds pretty good, right? Well, according to Machiavelli, you're in the most dangerous position imaginable. Now, think about this for a moment. When was the last time someone genuinely challenged your thinking? When did someone last tell you that your idea might not work, or that you're missing something crucial? If you can't remember, you might already be surrounded by what Machiavelli considers the greatest threat to effective leadership: flatterers. Machiavelli opens this discussion with a fascinating observation that cuts right to the heart of human nature. He argues that people are naturally inclined to deceive themselves about their own abilities and worth. We want to believe we're smarter, more capable, and more insightful than we actually are. It's a universal human tendency, and leaders, with their elevated positions and increased responsibilities, are particularly vulnerable to this self-deception. But here's where it gets really interesting. Flatterers don't just appear out of nowhere. We actually create the conditions for them to thrive. When we surround ourselves with people who depend on our approval for their livelihood, their advancement, or their very survival in an organization, we're essentially incentivizing them to tell us what we want to hear rather than what we need to hear. Machiavelli illustrates this with a powerful example from his own time. He points to Emperor Maximilian, a ruler who was so secretive and indecisive that he created a culture where advisors learned to simply agree with whatever direction he seemed to be leaning. The emperor would share his plans with no one, but when circumstances forced him to reveal his intentions, and people inevitably disagreed or pointed out flaws, he would completely reverse course. This created a vicious cycle where advisors stopped offering honest counsel altogether, knowing that any opposition would likely result in the emperor changing his mind and potentially blaming them for the confusion. Can you see how this plays out in modern workplaces? Think about those corporate environments where dissenting opinions are subtly discouraged, where the person who questions the boss's strategy gets passed over for promotion, or where team players are valued more than critical thinkers. We're creating our own Emperor Maximilians every day. The solution Machiavelli proposes is both elegant and challenging. A wise leader must create a carefully structured system for receiving honest feedback. This isn't about having an open-door policy where anyone can say anything at any time. That leads to chaos and undermines authority. Instead, it's about deliberately selecting wise counselors and giving them explicit permission, even a mandate, to speak truthfully on specific matters within their expertise. Here's the crucial part. These advisors should only speak when asked, and only about subjects the leader specifically requests their opinion on. This maintains the leader's authority while ensuring access to honest counsel. It's like having a personal board of advisors who understand that their job is to tell you the truth, not to make you feel good. But Machiavelli adds another layer that's absolutely essential. Once you've gathered this honest counsel, the decision must be yours alone. You listen to all perspectives, You weigh the evidence, but you don't govern by committee. This is where many modern leaders get tripped up. They either refuse to hear dissenting opinions, or they become paralyzed by trying to please everyone who offers advice. Think about some of the most successful leaders in recent history. Steve Jobs was famous for surrounding himself with people who weren't afraid to challenge his ideas, even though he made the final decisions himself. Warren Buffett has his longtime partner Charlie Munger, who's known for his willingness to disagree with Buffett publicly. These leaders understood what Machiavelli was getting at 500 years ago. The deeper wisdom here extends beyond just avoiding yes men. Machiavelli is really talking about the courage required for effective leadership. It takes courage to seek out people who might tell you you're wrong. It takes courage to ask hard questions about your own decisions. And it takes tremendous courage to remain open to the possibility that your initial instincts might be flawed. As we wrap up this insight from the Prince, consider this. The very position of leadership creates a natural isolation from truth. The higher you climb, the more people have incentives to tell you what you want to hear rather than what you need to hear. Recognizing this isn't a weakness, it's the beginning of wisdom. The question isn't whether you'll be surrounded by potential flatterers, but whether you'll have the insight and discipline to create systems that cut through the pleasant lies to reach the uncomfortable truths that actually matter. Picture this. You're sitting across from someone who's witnessed the rise and fall of empires, who's seen leaders crowned and dethroned, who understands power in ways that would make modern CEOs and politicians take notes furiously. That someone is Niccolò Machiavelli, and today we're diving into one of his most fascinating insights about leadership. The idea that truly effective leaders must embody both the lion and the fox. Now imagine you're leading a team, running a company, or even just trying to navigate office politics. You've probably noticed that some situations require you to be direct, forceful, maybe even a little intimidating. Other times, you need to be clever, diplomatic, perhaps even a bit sneaky. Machiavelli understood this duality 500 years ago, and his insights feel remarkably fresh today. The lion and the fox, what a perfect metaphor, right? Think about these animals for a moment. The lion is all about raw power, courage, and direct confrontation. When a lion wants something, it doesn't whisper politely or send a carefully worded email. It roars, it charges, it dominates through sheer force of presence. But here's the thing about lions, they can be trapped. Their very directness, their reliance on strength, can become a weakness when facing a more cunning opponent. Enter the fox. Clever, adaptable, always thinking 3 moves ahead. The fox doesn't win through brute force. It wins through intelligence, through understanding the terrain, through knowing when to retreat and when to pounce. But foxes have their limitations too. All the cunning in the world won't help you when you're facing an enemy that simply overpowers you through raw strength. Machiavelli argues that the most effective leaders understand they need both qualities. They need to know when to be the lion and when to be the fox. Now, think about this in your own life. When was the last time you faced a situation where being purely direct would have backfired? Maybe it was negotiating a raise, dealing with a difficult client, or managing a team conflict. Sometimes the fox approach, gathering information, building alliances, timing your moves carefully, works better than charging in like a lion. But there are other times when only the lion will do. When someone is undermining your authority, when a deadline is approaching and people are dragging their feet, when tough decisions need to be made and implemented quickly. In these moments, all the diplomatic finesse in the world won't substitute for clear, decisive action. What makes this concept so brilliant is that Machiavelli isn't just talking about switching between nice and mean, or between collaborative and authoritative. He's talking about fundamentally different approaches to problem-solving and influence. The lion sees obstacles and smashes through them. The fox sees obstacles and finds ways around them, under them, or convinces them to move aside voluntarily. Consider modern examples that illustrate this beautifully. Think about successful entrepreneurs who have built lasting companies. They often display both qualities: the lion's courage to take massive risks, to make bold decisions that others wouldn't dare, to persist when everyone says they're crazy. But they also show the fox's cunning in understanding market timing, in building strategic partnerships, in knowing which battles to fight and which to avoid entirely. Steve Jobs, for instance, was legendary for both his lion-like intensity, his demanding perfectionism, his willingness to completely upend entire product lines, and his fox-like strategic thinking. He understood that sometimes you need to be the lion who says, "This isn't good enough, start over." And sometimes you need to be the fox who quietly revolutionizes an industry while competitors think you're just making gadgets. The beauty of Machiavelli's insight is that he's not advocating for deception or cruelty. He's advocating for effectiveness. He's saying that if you only have one tool in your leadership toolkit, you'll eventually encounter situations where that tool is useless. The leader who can only be direct and forceful will be outmaneuvered by more subtle opponents. The leader who can only operate through cunning and manipulation will be overwhelmed when situations require immediate, decisive action. What's particularly relevant today is how this applies to our increasingly complex world. We live in an era where influence often matters more than authority, where networks matter more than hierarchies, where timing and positioning can be more important than resources. These are fox skills. But we also live in a world where bold action, clear communication, and unwavering commitment, lion skills, remain absolutely essential. The most effective leaders today understand that they're not choosing between being a lion or a fox. They're choosing when to be each one. They're developing both sets of skills, and perhaps more importantly, the wisdom to know which approach each situation demands. As we continue exploring Machiavelli's timeless insights, remember that his goal isn't to make you more ruthless. It's to make you more effective, more adaptable, more capable of achieving your goals while navigating an inherently complex world. Picture this. You're sitting across from someone who's witnessed the rise and fall of empires, who's seen brilliant leaders triumph against impossible odds and watched others crumble despite having every advantage. That's essentially what we're getting when Machiavelli talks about fortune and virtue, and trust me, this conversation is about to get fascinating. Now, when Machiavelli uses the word virtue, he's not talking about being a good person in Sunday school. He's talking about something much more practical and, frankly, more interesting. Virtue, in his world, means skill, competence, and the ability to adapt and respond to whatever life throws at you. Think of it as being the kind of person who doesn't just survive chaos, but actually finds a way to thrive in it. Machiavelli had this brilliant way of thinking about fortune as a river. Sometimes it flows gently and you can navigate it easily, but sometimes it becomes a raging torrent that destroys everything in its path. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Most people, when they see that calm river, they just enjoy the smooth sailing. They don't prepare for the flood. But the truly skilled leader, the one with what Machiavelli calls virtue, is building dikes and channels during the calm times, preparing for when that river inevitably turns violent. Think about this for a moment. How many businesses have we seen that were riding high during good economic times, only to completely collapse when the market shifted? And then there are others, like Amazon during the dot-com crash, that not only survived but emerged stronger because they had prepared for turbulence. Jeff Bezos wasn't just lucky. He demonstrated exactly what Machiavelli meant by virtue, constantly adapting and preparing for different scenarios. Machiavelli tells us this fascinating story about Cesare Borgia, and whether you love him or hate him, you have to admire his preparation. Borgia didn't just rely on his father being pope. He built alliances, secured resources, and created backup plans for his backup plans. When fortune inevitably turned against him, he had systems in place to handle it. The guy understood that you can't control the weather, but you can absolutely control how well you've built your house. But here's where Machiavelli gets really provocative. He suggests that fortune is actually a bit like a woman who favors the bold and the young. Now, before you roll your eyes at the 16th century gender politics, let's dig into what he's really saying here. Fortune favors those who act decisively, who don't hesitate when opportunity knocks, and who aren't paralyzed by overthinking every possible outcome. Consider how many opportunities we miss because we're busy making pro and con lists while someone else is already taking action. Machiavelli isn't advocating for recklessness. He's pointing out that there's a sweet spot between careful preparation and decisive action. You need both the patience to prepare and the courage to act when the moment is right. The most powerful insight here is that fortune and virtue aren't opposites, they're dance partners. Fortune provides the music, but virtue determines how well you dance. You might get dealt a terrible hand, but virtue is about playing that hand brilliantly. You might get dealt a fantastic hand, but without virtue, you'll probably waste it. Look at someone like Oprah Winfrey. She certainly faced challenging circumstances early in life, but she developed the skills, the preparation, and the adaptability to not just overcome those challenges, but to transform them into strengths. She didn't wait for perfect conditions. She created opportunities through preparation meeting the right moment. Machiavelli argues that roughly half of our actions are governed by fortune and half by our own agency. This is incredibly liberating when you think about it. Yes, there are things completely outside your control, but there's an enormous space where your skill, preparation, and decision-making can make all the difference. The practical wisdom here is profound. Instead of just hoping things work out, start building your capacity to handle uncertainty. Develop multiple skills, create diverse networks, save resources for tough times, and most importantly, practice making decisions quickly with incomplete information. Because here's the thing about fortune. It rarely gives you all the information you want before demanding that you act. As we move forward in exploring Machiavelli's insights, remember that this balance between preparation and adaptability, between planning and seizing the moment, runs through everything he teaches about effective leadership. The leaders who master this balance don't just survive the chaos of their times, they shape it to their advantage, turning the unpredictable river of fortune into a source of power rather than destruction. As we close our journey through Machiavelli's The Prince, we've explored one of history's most unflinching examinations of power and leadership. This isn't just a book about ruling kingdoms. It's a masterclass in understanding human nature, navigating complex relationships, and making difficult decisions when the stakes are high. Machiavelli stripped away the romantic notions of leadership to reveal its raw realities. He showed us that effective leadership often requires uncomfortable choices, that good intentions without practical wisdom can lead to disaster, and that understanding people as they are, not as we wish they were, is essential for creating positive change. Here are the key takeaways that can transform how you approach leadership in your own life. Master the balance between firmness and flexibility. Machiavelli's lion and fox metaphor isn't about being deceptive, it's about adaptability. In your daily leadership, whether managing a team or raising children, learn when to be direct and when to be diplomatic. Start by observing situations before reacting. Ask yourself, does this moment need strength or strategy? Build genuine relationships before you need them. Machiavelli emphasized that alliances formed in crisis are weak. In your career and personal life, invest in relationships during calm periods. Reach out to colleagues not just when you need something. Check in with friends regularly. Be incredibly small in your approach, one genuine conversation at a time. Prepare for multiple scenarios always. The Prince teaches us that fortune favors the prepared. In your planning, whether for business or personal goals, always have a plan B. Ask yourself, what could go wrong and how would I respond? Start small. Even having a backup plan for your morning routine builds this thinking muscle. Make difficult decisions with clarity, not cruelty. When Machiavelli discussed harsh measures, he emphasized they should be swift, purposeful, and rare. In your leadership, address problems directly rather than letting them fester. Be patient with yourself as you develop this courage. It takes practice to have difficult conversations with kindness but firmness. Study human nature without cynicism. Machiavelli observed people realistically, but his goal was effective governance, not manipulation. Watch how people behave under stress, what motivates them, what they fear. Use this understanding to communicate better, to inspire more effectively, and to build systems that work with human nature rather than against it. The Prince reminds us that leadership is ultimately about service, creating stability, prosperity, and security for those in your care, whether that's a family, a team, or a community. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below with at least one idea from this book that stuck with you, one concept you're going to carry forward. It could be something that challenged your thinking, something you want to try, or even something you disagreed with. Your insight might be exactly what another listener needs to hear today. And if this summary gave you something valuable, a new perspective, a spark of motivation, or even just a peaceful hour with your coffee, share it with someone who might need it too. Subscribe to One Book, One Coffee, and hit that bell icon so you never miss a new summary. Every week, we sit down together with one great book, one warm cup of coffee, and the simple belief that wisdom, shared well, can change lives. Until next time, keep reading, keep growing, and remember, every small step counts. See you at the next book.